Review of history beginning 1066. Hopefully this will change your paradigm. 1066, Halley's Comet appeared. 1100, North America recognized the Pueblos' third period of civilization in America. In South America, they were given permission to colonize Polynesia. 1132, England had a charter to commercialize all industry. 1151, Iceland decided to have insurance against the plague and the fire. 1151, the Chinese began using explosives. 1170, England had an inquest of sheriffs, which was to strengthen the royal treasury. In 1173, England had an influenza epidemic, and it says that it was imported. In 1200, Constantinople had 60,000 Italian merchants. In 1230, Europe had a bad case of the leprosy, which they say was imported. In 1233, England began mining coal, and in 1269, England instituted toll roads. In 1278, London hung 278 Jews for clipping coin, and in 1290, they began a printing press called block printing, which preceded Gutenberg. Remember that. In 1297, New Zealand confirmed that the Moa's giant giraffe bird had died out. In 1300, Europe decided to put a temporary end on the slave trade. In 1327, Munich had a great fire. In 1332, India had the bubonic plague. In 1345, Florence bankrupted their banking. In 1347 to 51, Europe had a case of the Black Death, which killed 75 million people. And then in 1361, it reappeared. In 1364, Mexico found the Aztecs had built their Tenochtitlan civilization. In 1366, remember these numbers. The 66 is a very important number. 1366, weavers in Augsburg were consolidated by Fugger, F-U-G-G-A-R or E-R. It goes both ways. Hard to look up, but it's the name of a very powerful family that I had never heard about until 1366. 1384, London, the fishmongers were incorporated. In 1392, England said no foreigners may retail any goods. In 1407, London instituted the Bedlam Insane Asylum. In 1414, remember the number, Florence decided that the Medici family bankers would provide money to the papacy. How nice. In 1433, the double eagle emblem was assigned to Rome. And in 1453, Gutenberg and his banker printed the first Bible. That's another good story. In 1464 in France, they decided to have royal mail. I have a feeling there's a lot going on with the post office. I'm going to figure it out, but just a note. In 1472, the Danish, a man named Pining, discovered Newfoundland. In 1473, the Augsburgs, that are part of the Fuggers, connected with the Habsburg family. In 1484, in Europe, Richard III reforms all the laws for taxes and trade. In 1492, in Europe, there was book publishing founder, printer, and bookseller system set up to control all the books. In 1495 in Europe, there was a syphilis epidemic of the soldiers primarily. In 1495, a guy named Payne, Columbus's monk on his first trip, brought back and explained to England the tobacco plant. In 1500, the very first C-section was done by a pig gelder, no doubt. And in 1504, Henry VII traded under the crown and said that all trade now will come under the crown. In 1505, the African East Coast was found to have trade factories. The Portuguese found them. In 1506, spices from the East Indies were traded to Europe by the Fugger family. In 1508, the Holy Roman Empire decided that Fugger could make himself a hereditary knight. And then in 1509, Fugger loaned Emperor Maximilian I 170,000, oh boy, I didn't write it down. It's a kind of money, and I do not know. It's not a dollar. It's, I'll figure it out. But 1509, Constantinople had a major earthquake. Also, Bartolome de la Casa, the Roman Catholic bishop that went with Columbus, decided, he didn't go with Columbus. This bishop decided that from now on, every Spanish settler to the New World had to bring a certain number of slaves with him. In 1510 in Hamburg, they decided that that would be the free city of the Holy Roman Empire. This is a funny one. In 1512 in Augsburg, there was a ban on quacks. Imagine that. In 1514, there was German resistance to the Fugger family. They were mad because their emperor owed so much money to the Fuggers. In Europe, they finally had vessels in China waters for the first time. And then also in 1514 in Germany, the House Fugger was given the right to sell papal indulgences. How nice. Now, in 1517, Archduke Charles had a monopoly to sell slaves to the Florida merchants. Why didn't I think of that? In 1518, African slaves, we were licensed to import 4,000 slaves to Spanish American colonies by the king. How nice. And then in 1523, marine insurance policies were available. In 1523, also Jacob Fugger, Augsburg, he died. What would happen? In 1528 in England, the plague broke out again. And also in 1528, Charles V, to the Augsburg merchants, they formed a group. The Fuggers weren't going anywhere. And guess what? They get to colonize Venezuela. In 1530, there was a Holy Roman Empire criminal code that was finally put together. And then in 1533, the lunatic asylums were started. In 1534 in England, the sheep farmers were allowed only to have 2,000 sheep each. And then in 1535 in London, they started the exchange, money exchange. In 1535 also, there was a statute called Users, which took the power from England landowners. I've got to look that up. In 1544 in Peru, silver mines were started. In 1546, the Fugger fortune was 4 million guldens. That's what that was before, not a dollar, but a gulden. In 1547 in London, they established a poor rate, a tax rate for poor folk. At the same time, Mexican began silver mining. In 1546, the Fugger fortune, I just said that. In 1549, in South America, Jesuit missions were sent. In 1555, America took the tobacco plant to Spain. And in 1556, in London, there was a printing monopoly established. In 1557, in Europe, influenza broke out again. And in 1558, they established the Hamburg Exchange for money. In 1560, tobacco was taken to West Europe. In 1562, there was a French attempt to colonize Florida. At that same time, a man named John Hawkins went to the New World and established the slave trade. And at that same time, Paris found the plague. In 1563, the plague was bad in Paris, 20,000 dead. And in 1564, John Hawkins made his second voyage to America to take care of those slaves. In 1565, there was a royal exchange in London with the name of Mr. Grisham. And at that same year, John Hawkins, our American rep, brought back sweet potatoes and tobacco to England. In 1566, in Venice, they started the newspaper. There are two things that I want to point out: newspapers and post office. I'm going to find out. Well, of course, newspapers, but during this period, so many newspapers were started. 1567 in South America, 2 million Indians had typhoid fever. And in 1568, the bricklayers were organized. In 1569 in Lisbon, 40,000 people died of a carbuncular fever. And in 1571, they organized the blacksmiths. In 1573, Germany started sugarcane refinery. And in 1575 in Sicily, there was a plague. Now, we start with the trading companies. In 1578, there was Levant Trading, authorized by London to colonize Turkey. In 1579, there was Eastland Company, authorized by England to colonize Scandinavia. In 1580, London had an earthquake, and all new building was banned until they could refigure out things. In 1588, England established the Guinea Company. Don't know what they did yet. And in 1592, the plague came back, killing 15,000. 1594, there was a port trade monopoly. No, the port trade monopoly in India was broken. In 1597, they figured out the way to transport criminals to the colonies and how that would be done. In 1597, the English merchants expelled the Holy Roman Empire for treatment of the Hanseatic League. I'll figure out more about that. 1599, Spain had an outbreak of the plague, and then in 1600, set up the Amsterdam Bank. 1603, England had another heavy plague hit, and in 1605, the butchers and shipwrights were organized. In England at that time, farms, they farmed all customs revenue to a consortium for annual rent. So England took all the customs revenue and put it all together and figured out how to make money off it. At that same time, they organized the apothecary and groceries. In 1607, the Bank of Genoa fails and caused Spain bankruptcy. But they had taken in a ton of gold, so there's a problem there. In 1609, the Bank of Amsterdam was started. The Dutch East India Company took tea to Europe. They introduced the word share, and the stationers all over sent all books. Every book would now be sent to Oxford. the Dutch began trading in Japan. In 1611, James I figured out a Baronese way to raise money for the aristocrats. And in 1612, in Virginia, they were given the right to colonize Bermuda. The Dutch at that time were given the right to use Manhattan for fur trading, and Virginia established the tobacco plant. In 1613, there was an exchange set up in Amsterdam for money. I lost my place. Also, Belfast was incorporated and water was taken to England. Hugh Middleton of New River figured out that, and copper was coined. In 1614, the Augsburg went into bankruptcy. That's the Fuggers, and set up the Founders Company. In 1614, Pocahontas marries Rolfe. I'm related to both of them. And then they set up an adventurer's monopoly on cloth. In 1617, Pocahontas dies. Really interesting story there. And in 1619, the Giro Bank in Hamburg was started to improve the desolate state of currency. In 1619, Negro slaves arrived in Virginia. The Heidelberg University Library sacked Count Tilly. Potatoes were introduced to Germany. And guess what? The Papal Chancellery adopts January 1 as the first day of the year. That's important. 1623, New Hampshire was settled. 1623, England had a patent law to protect all inventors. 1623, the Dutch started in New Amsterdam, English in Eastern India. They set up a colonial office in England. English settled the Barbados, and a tobacco tax and monopoly was set up. In 1626, the French settled on the Senegal River. Peter Minuit of the Dutch West India Company buys Manhattan from the chiefs for 60 guilders, or $24. The Dutch colony of New Amsterdam was set up, and the Swedish South Sea Company. In 1629, the Massachusetts colony was established. In 1630, pirates settled Tortugas. Public advertising started. Clockmakers were incorporated. English settled Leeward Islands. Naples and Vesuvius had an earthquake. Well, Naples had an earthquake and Vesuvius went off. English settled Antigua and Montserrat. In 1633, the Dutch settled Connecticut. The English settled Malabar. New Haven, Connecticut was settled. The Swedes settled Delaware River. The English settled Madras. And in 1639, the first printing press in America was opened. The English settled Fort George, Bengal. French settled Michigan. Income property tax was started in England, and Montreal was founded. In 1647, the yellow fever broke out in Barbados. Free enterprise started in England, The American Indian extermination program began. The first planter of the Americas bird dies. In 1661, John Everly made an early attack on air pollution. 1663, Robert Carter, another Virginia planter, died. He would be responsible for birthing down the road 6 presidents. And in 1665, Prince Archbishop Munster sold 7,000 subjects as soldiers. The Great Plague of London broke out in 1665 with 68,596 dead, and yes, that adds up to 9. In 1666, there was the Great Fire of London, and the felt makers were organized. In 1669, there was cholera in China and French trade in India. In 1670, the Hudson Bay Company started a royal charter to trade in the Hudson Bay region of North America where draining occurred. In Austria, they had a tobacco monopoly. In England, they set up direct control of a customs system. Also, the Royal African Company Charter was set up, and the Hoare H-O-A-R-E family founds the Bank of London. The Miyatsui family starts trading in Japan, and in 1674, another Richard Byrd II dies, the second rich Virginia planter. In England, there's an influenza epidemic again. In 1676, England decides to protect the Sabbath and says that the dodo flightless bird is now extinct. The first German immigrants reach North America. Smyrna is destroyed with an earthquake. And in 1692, the Bank of London is started with Coutts and Coy. In 1694, England decides to double their salt tax. There was a lot going on. They needed money. The Royal Bank in Scotland was started. The Board of Trade and Plantations was established. England property insurance was established. In 1698, paper was first manufactured in North America, and Russia began to tax the beard. In 1699, Russia decided that January 1 instead of September 1 would be the New Year date. And all unmarried were taxed in Berlin. A book was written called The Selling of Joseph Against Slavery in that year, and the commode was made popular. Mrs. White's Chocolate Factory set up kind of a little secret organization for the Tory party. And that's 1066 to 1699. Did your paradigm of Old England change at all?